Welcome. Looks like the date is wrong. I haven't fixed that. It's 2025, not 2015 or 2024, but I did update this lecture for today. Um, this is a part of a series that I give to our fellows, and everybody else is kind of open to folks, including other fellows at other programs, as well as OSMED members if they're interested in this sort of stuff. And this is the fourth one. So if you haven't caught up, if you haven't seen the other ones, we are making them available online. The last year's version of these is up on the MGH Spearmid website. But there were three other lectures that kind of got us to this point. So we've talked about the concepts of risk in general in the first lecture, some of the ways that NASA handles risk management in the second lecture. We talked about computational approaches to risk management, so the math behind it, and the PRA analysis. And then this one's about levels of evidence. And the one after this is going to be about causal diagramming. And I've struggled with the order of these two because they are all related, and it's hard sometimes to figure out what should come before what else. This is a general discussion about levels of evidence, and you can see my subtitle here. Should we really take that paper seriously? And that's a valid question that comes up in a lot of places, right? And there's a lot of reasons why we struggle with evidence in human spaceflight. We'll get into what those are. But I think it's important to understand sort of structurally what we've kind of done with evidence, stratification, and how you formally approach ideas of how strong is evidence in these domains. Because I think there's a lot of opportunities in human spaceflight to sort of bloat evidence or inflate evidence based on the fact that we might not have better evidence available. That doesn't mean that the evidence that you've got right now in your hand is automatically high quality, just because it's the best quality that you have so far. And so it's real important to differentiate between those things. My colleague Rob, I think, is on for this one. And we sometimes talk about evidence stuff very in challenging ways. And I'm going to start this out really with kind of giving you a highlight of something that happened a few years ago. This is in 2019, where evidence gets kind of caught by the media and then blown up into something that is probably much bigger than it should be. And so this one was posted on MSNBC in August of 2019. So I was still at the Human System Risk Board at the time. And you can see what their headline looks like. These are designed to catch people's attention, right? We all understand that the media interpretation of scientific results is often very different from what we would say as scientists. But you can see on the left what was actually said in the article that MSNBC put up there. So they talked about a new NASA-funded study suggesting that chronic exposure to radiation can harm astronauts' minds as well as their bodies. This could be a big deal, right? And you see here the nature of the radiation environment in space will not deter our efforts, but it may be the single biggest obstacle humankind must resolve to travel beyond the Earth's orbit. And it's referencing their study in the journal eNeuro earlier in the month. So as the chair of the risk board at the time, people then complained to me because they were like, what the hell is this? And I said, it's not like the media comes to talk to me about these things and ask me if this is correct. They just run with whatever they get. So it got up high enough that the Office of the Chief Health and Medical Officer was asked to comment. So J.D. Polk, who's still there, right? And you can see what his quote is on the left side, right? With the dosages that we're expecting with the Mars mission, I'm not expecting to have a massive amount of cognitive decline in astronauts. Is there a risk they're going to come back with horrible cognitive decline and forget how to push the red button for reentry? No. And that sounds like JD. And then, of course, in the interest of fair and balanced, or whatever you want to call it, they went to the senior author, Charles Lamolli, who's a radiation scientist. And he said, well, I'm not sure what literature Dr. Polk is reading, but I don't agree with the context he places our work in, and I don't agree with his statements. And now it's turned into a he said, she said. So this is a reason. This is a reason why we, when we do residencies and other things, do things like journal clubs, is not to make people aware of what is going on in the research, but to critically evaluate the research, because it's very easy to take us out of context. And so it's worth kind of talking about whether the evidence really supports the statements that the researchers made, right? And if I go back here, right, it may be the single biggest obstacle humankind must resolve to travel beyond Earth's orbit. I will tell you that in my time as the risk manager, looking over all of the risks, and also till today, I really don't think that this is the biggest obstacle that humankind must resolve. So let's talk about why. So the reason why these things pop up and why evidence matters in the context of risk management is primarily because nobody trusts each other. Okay. Literally across programs, and you'll find this in commercial companies too, people don't really trust each other when it comes to their statements about, hey, what's more important than something else? What should be prioritized? How should we think about some of these things? In particular, program managers do not trust the scientists at NASA. And primarily, I think it's because they don't really know them or have much interaction. They just hear kind of almost like a game of telephone that the scientists say this thing matters or that thing matters. And the scientists don't trust the program managers because they feel like the program managers always are not listening and are just trying to figure out how to cut things that they don't think are important. And then you're, as somebody who works within this field as a physician, whether you're a flight surgeon or a researcher or at some other capacity, you're going to have to try to figure out what's the right thing to recommend and how to get people to understand and believe that the things that you're bringing forward actually matter. And first, you got to convince yourself that they actually matter, right? So we have a challenge that comes with communicating evidence and certainty. And in the first lecture where we talked about risk concepts, we talked about uncertainty, and we actually differentiated it from risk. The now flipping that and inverting it and saying certainty, how certain are we that something that we say is important is really important, is a challenge for us. And it's still something that we're learning how to do. So communication is critical here. We do have a lot of systematic approaches to strength of evidence, especially in medicine and life sciences research, and they're out there. We'll talk about a couple of them. But those don't often apply in a like-to-like fashion to the data sets and the evidence for human spaceflight. And the reason why is because of the things that you see here, right? One, that small n problem is something that is kind of very well understood, that we haven't had a large amounts of data from many different individuals in spaceflight. We don't have a great grasp on biologic variability. We have a huge amount of information coming out of things like animal models or cellular research, and trying to translate that to what we should understand or think about the human responses in spaceflight has been a massive challenge. In fact, Rob and I are both kind of working to close out some research with HFBP right now on trying to develop some of the pathways to appropriately use things like animal research when generalizing to human results. So we still have a lot of ongoing challenges with this. And there's a lot of stuff that really depends on the level of human system integration within spaceflight, how analogs and other things can be translated into spaceflight results. So it isn't as easy as just taking some of the systems for strength of evidence that are out there and then saying, well, you should do it this way. Because usually what ends up happening is you find a whole bunch of, well, what about this? Exceptions to the ways that they're done. So despite all these limitations, programs are going to still go forward, right? We as physicians within the space medicine world are really very rarely in control of go, no-go decisions, and probably almost never. but we do have influence. And so we have to figure out how to think about that influence and how to leverage it. And so I always come back to this quote from the Oxford Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, right? What are we to do when the irresistible force of the need to offer clinical advice meets with the immovable object of flawed evidence? All we can do is our best. We give the advice, but we alert the advisees to the flaws in the evidence on which it is based. Right. And that is sort of the balancing act that we've had to try to work with across human spaceflight in general when it comes to human system risk and evidence. So it's really important to understand where our evidence is coming from. Now, what you see here is one set of data, right? Medical data, clinical care, occupational surveillance. From the physician's perspective, we kind of start in this domain as a source of information and evidence about what has happened before in spaceflight. And because it's happened before, maybe we should take it seriously. But it's not the only thing that really informs our evidence base. It's not just what has happened, but it's what has happened in the context of the environment that people were experiencing and the actions or tasks that they were doing, right? Environmental and operational data is part of what tells us about what's different in spaceflight than it is on terrestrial medicine. So we need both of those sources of data to really inform how we think about our evidence and contextualize it, right? The medical data isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening, well, I guess that's a terrible pun. It's happening in the context of the environment of the spacecraft and the activities we're asking people to do. But there's more context than just that. We also, in theory, want to know how well people are doing within those contexts, right? Training effectiveness, task completion rate, workload. These are all things that data is collected on, oftentimes by, at least in NASA, by FOD, the Flight Operations Directorate, that oftentimes is not made available to people doing human research, in part, usually because of political things. The astronauts don't want their data out there. Flight operations doesn't want people seeing, that astronauts are making mistakes, something like that. There's usually not a very valid sort of ethical reason for it or research reason, but a lot of times it's just blocked, at least in the NASA's context, because of preferences. And then in addition to all those things that happen in terms of spaceflight, we've also got all this research data, right? We've got ground analogs and animal data and all these other things that are stuff that can give us insight or maybe point a direction on what to expect in terms of our evidence. But then we struggle with how does it relate and how should we think about it? At NASA, at least, all of these things are assessed in the context of their strength of evidence by subject matter experts. And this is one of those areas where, at some point in the future, it may be systematized enough to where AI can do a reliable job on it. But I really don't think that we're there right now. This is not something that you export or outsource to ChatGPT, right? This is a value judgment based on the expertise of scientists about how strong or good the evidence is that is informing a variety of different things that we need to communicate to our programs, right? How good is your countermeasures? How much impact are we expecting from this exposure? How likely are our astronauts to get cancer later in their lives from the radiation exposures, right? All these sort of things. They're all different sort of problems. And so they have to be interpreted in the context of the problems. And it's not just all that, but all those things, at some point you make a decision about, okay, here's our best assessment of our evidence. This is informing our L by C. This is helping to, especially in quantitative senses, provide bounds on our uncertainty and to give a level of evidence assessment from subject matter experts helps our managers and other people understand, hey, how well do we think we really know this stuff? Which folds into the discussions that are had about what should we design in, how much resilience and how much robustness and how much redundancy should we put into these systems or countermeasures and things like that. But even this isn't the full picture because prior to getting to all those things, right, how the astronauts operate is also a function of the engineered system that they're a part of, right? Not just the environment and data, but all of these other things that kind of feed into what engineering decisions were made and why, and did those engineering decisions affect an astronaut's health or performance, for example. You may be able to have and understand the environment that somebody was in when they were doing a certain activity, but what you may not understand if you don't look at the engineering data is that the only reason they stayed at that certain level of performance was because the Eclipse machine couldn't actually take out CO2 any faster, right? So there are invisible bounds around things that often contextualize what we understand about what's happened in space. So this is that overview of where is all of our evidence coming from. And we've got a lot of it, even though we haven't had a lot of people in space. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's all good. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's all evidence that we should base critical decisions on. And so learning to separate that out is what's super important for our future work. So I mentioned access to information challenges, right? This was a table of information that I put out when I wrote the medical risk evidence book for HRP back in 2017. And I made a very intentional choice to put in appendices in that give out as much information as we were allowed to give out about what has happened clinically and in space, and in some cases, frequencies of those things. There's a number of appendices back there. But you'll notice that I could only go up through ISS Expedition 13, which was in 2006, right? That is severely limited, okay? And you got to realize that a number of the things that we have available from the clinical side, and especially from the performance side, right? How well are they doing their jobs? How much are they making errors, right? Those things are just not made available by the agency. So you have to acknowledge that sometimes we just can't get at the information that we really want. But we've tried to push out as much as we possibly can, and we got to do the best that we can with the information that we have available. Now, in the past, there have been sort of structured approaches to evidence that have been attempted. And what you're seeing here is one of those proposed levels of evidence processes that was used before I became the chair of the board. In this case, what we have is the consequence levels, right, which are taken from what was the 3x4 L by C matrix that I showed in lecture 1. These are the consequence levels, and they've sort of linked them to these sort of what kind of study would get you here, right? Now, what I want you to note is that these are very epidemiologic oriented, right? Case study, case series, descriptive study, prevalence, incidence, association, and then this idea of causation. And what they did was they took cellular research, animal research, terrestrial research, and spaceflight research. And what you'll immediately notice is that the person here gives you insight that these two are human and the animal ones are not. But they put the flight and the terrestrial ones together for cellular and animal, and they split them out for human. And then what they did was they said, fill in the boxes for each of these things for how many studies you've got that fit in these different things. And that was how they sort of figured out, hey, where are we really living? Are we at this prevalence level of evidence, proportion, or are we higher or lower? And it was really based on number of publications or amount of LSAH data. So what are the issues with this, right? Well, for one thing, there's absolutely no quality of evidence assessment. Subject matter experts are supposed to be critically evaluating those publications, and there was literally no record of any of that. Another thing was that there wasn't any guidance on what qualified as causal as opposed to association, which is a part of the reason why we developed causal diagramming as part of risk management. And then, as I mentioned, right, they differentiate between terrestrial and spaceflight human-derived evidence, but they didn't make this mistake or make this distinction for the cellular and animal evidence that was out there. And it's like trying to figure out, how do we mash all this stuff together, even though these things are not necessarily like for like. But the biggest problem that I had with that way of doing things is that it really gave managers the idea that they could just assume that the number of papers that were written on a topic was reflective of the strength of evidence of that topic. And that is absolutely a non-scientific way to do that. So we decided that we needed to come to a different way of doing this. And a lot of this work was done with Rob Reynolds. He was actually critical in figuring out, well, how do we approach this from a different direction? So just so you see, right, this isn't just the blank one. This is risk of acute and chronic carbon dioxide exposure. And what you've got here is these terrestrial clinical analogs, and they just say over 100 papers, over 100 papers, over 100 papers with this like thumbs up, right? And then the spaceflight one, you've got CO2 and headaches in retrospective. And they said, look, we're at this association that CO2 is bad for the humans. And when we went to have arguments with engineering, what came up was, we can't find a lot of these papers, and they kind of give mixed evidence on cognitive function, but the only thing that we really had was a paper by Jen Law that tracked how many headaches astronauts had, right? So even this idea of over hundreds really didn't apply, because why? Well, many of them in the terrestrial setting actually ended up giving conflicting data, so you didn't have coherence within the data sets. And you didn't have any specificity about what was happening in spaceflight as opposed to these terrestrial things. So how well do these really apply? And the terms that I'm using, things like coherence and specificity, are really about causality, right? And what you see here is most of this is about associative or epidemiologic approaches that are not necessarily about causality, right? So the place to start in this is to recognize that whenever you pick up a paper and read it, right, you are never reading the final word on anything with one paper or one study. It is a contribution to the corpus of knowledge that we have within a certain domain, right? And that contribution can be good or bad depending on the rigor that they bring to how well they do the study. And that's what quality of evidence is, right? You see the words on the page here: the extent to which all aspects of a study's design and conduct can be shown to protect against systematic bias, non-systematic bias, and inferential error. Okay. That is what quality of evidence is about. It's about taking a look at one paper and saying, how well do we believe this, right? Did they really do the extra steps that are required in order to protect against our own bias? Because there's no way to get around bias, but we can try to do a lot of different things in research to protect against it. Okay. And that's a part of our understanding of the strength of evidence. And the way I tend to think about it is like this, right? Quality of evidence helps establish the degree to which a specific evidence, paper, results, whatever, is applicable to the problem that we're talking about at hand, right? And so if this blue thing right here is one study, right, and you're looking at our problem, our outcomes, then this quality of evidence, right, is can kind of be represented as how thick and assertive is that line right there, that this study helps us understand our outcomes, right? We think about quality of evidence in terms of scientific rigor and proximity to the problem in question. And proximity is going to come back later when we talk about evidence and analogs, because specificity is really a discussion of proximity, right? How close is what the study did to what we are thinking about is going to happen in spaceflight? Because most of the studies have either maybe they're done terrestrially in an analog, so it's not like space, or maybe they're done in space in an animal, so it's not like humans, right? And we have this tension and this challenge there of understanding. And so that quality of evidence is about that one study. And there can be more than one study, and they may have varying different qualities of evidence, right? Some of them may be super strong, and some of them may be very wishy-washy. And they're all going to try to give you information on some of the outcomes that we're interested in, and you've got to interpret that, right? What should we believe, especially if these things maybe don't agree on what the outcomes are? How do you choose what to believe? And that quality of evidence is about each of those individual studies. The level of evidence is about looking at the entire corpus, right? All of those things together. Level of evidence supports the high-level assertion of risk posture, considering all of the contributing evidence that we are able to look at. So it's all of that stuff together, and you say, what does the bulk of it say? And from that, you get to inform your risk posture, and you give a sense of how certain are we about this risk posture, right? How certain are we that it is a problem? How certain are we that the solutions that we're offering to the problem are actually going to help reduce it? Those are two critical questions, okay? So we've seen quality of evidence measurements and structures in different places. So here's AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Physicians will be familiar with this. Other folks might not be as familiar with this, right? These are guides and guidelines for figuring out how do we tell whether a study is good quality or not so great quality. Did I hear somebody have a question in the background there? Okay. And you can see some of the things that we look at, right? There's study limitations, directness, whether evidence relates to interventions directly health, support an outcome, right? Or if they're indirect, there are consistency, precision, reporting bias. These are all things that are super important in thinking about in clinical studies. And if those clinical studies are some of the things that you're looking at as part of your evidence, then these absolutely apply and are ways to evaluate the quality, right? But what if it's not a clinical study, or what if it's an animal study? And so we actually wrote in some, hey, you need to be able to demonstrate that some of the things that you've done are holding to a certain level of scientific rigor, right? That these mouse studies, these animal studies, right, they translate to a relevant human age translation, that there are some animals that are chosen for the population, that there's a match of experiment and control groups, that there are appropriate animal strains being used, that they're blind coding analysis, right? That you've done your statistics rigorously, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we were kind of lacking some of this for the application to spaceflight stuff. So we made this, and most of this is the result of Tom Williams' work, who was the head of the human factors and behavioral performance element at the time at NASA. So how do you get to that, determining whether or not studies? Question? Okay. And so at the end of the day, what we did at NASA is we had subject matter experts use their expertise to evaluate and appraise that quality of evidence, right? Whether it's a data that's in LSAH or studies or publications that they're bringing forward to contribute to the risk estimation, we're asking them to also say, give us insight into the quality of evidence, right? Even if it's just good quality, bad quality, right? Should we listen to this or should we not? Should we include it in the corpus of knowledge, or is this crappy enough that we should be getting rid of it, right? And those AHRQ guidelines, animal study guidelines, other things like that, they are just that. They're guidelines for evaluating and assigning a quality of evidence. And in some cases, we may not have great quality of evidence. You might have crappy quality of evidence for all the studies that you have because we don't have a lot of research, right? What then? Well, it goes back to that quote that I brought up, right? If you have and can give a clear representation of the lack of certainty that it brings, you got to talk about it. If it's a critical question, if it's something that they're going to make a decision on regardless, then maybe you have to rely on that low quality of evidence information and justify certain things like more characterization research and stuff like that. But if you have really crappy quality of evidence for stuff, you really shouldn't be up prioritizing things with respect to other things that you might fund or things like that. So there's some what can you do with this stuff that I'll get into at the end of the lecture. Okay. Um, and so we look towards causality. And there has been a huge amount of work in causal inference in the last 20, 30 years that has kind of changed some of the face of the way we think about evidence. And we wanted to leverage some of that work in thinking about spaceflight, because what we're really saying with human spaceflight is that if you put somebody into this adverse environment, that the changes in the exposures in that environment are going to cause different outcomes than we would see in a terrestrial environment. And we really wanted to get at cause and effect here. And so we're using causal inference in the way that we think about evidence. We want to make sure that we're relating to that. So when we went back to the drawing board on how would we do level of evidence evaluation, we went to the basics of causality. And so Rob brought these up and said, you know what, there's 9 A. Bradford Hill criteria that really form the basis of our understanding of causal inference. How do you match a cause with an effect? We reviewed those and we reduced it to 6. And these 6 are the causal guidelines that we decided to use for assessing level of evidence. Now, we'll talk about each of them kind of in turn, but some of these are very intuitive, right? Temporality, a cause must become before effect. Analogy, we have something similar that we look at that gives us insight about the problem at hand. It's an analog of what we're doing. And you'll see analog being used a lot, both in human spaceflight analogs or in animals as analogs or other things like that. Mechanism. Do we have a plausible theoretical explanation for how the thing is happening, right? That's a critical part of this. And that's what a lot of research is geared towards in the biomedical domain. And then the next 3 are really about not is it plausible that it could be the cause and effect pair, but how strong are we really understanding that? So if we have reproducible evidence from multiple investigators, that's a big help, right? If we really can say that this experiment matches specifically the aspects that are of interest to us in spaceflight, right? Which is part of the reason why people do like head down bed rest, right? They're trying to figure out how to get closer in specificity to what happens with the fluid shifts in the body. It doesn't mean it's perfectly specific, but it's closer, right? And all of those things are really about, you can kind of apply them to a single study almost, or a single piece of research, but coherence at the end of the day is like that whole level of evidence thing, right? Are all of those studies pointing in the same direction, or are they disagreeing with each other? That's what coherence really gets to, all right? And so we use these things then to create a scoring system. And we try to make it as simple and applicable as possible. So you can see here that in order to get to speculative level of evidence, and speculative is a very descriptive term for this, right? You must meet temporality and analogy, right? The thing you're studying the effect of the thing you're studying has to happen after the cause, and you have to have enough analogy from other things to be able to have some insight that this could be like that. That is literally the bare minimum that we're talking about for entry into our thought processes as something that qualifies as evidence about human spaceflight. If it doesn't meet those 2 things, you shouldn't even be talking about it, right? And then if you can get at least one of these next 3, mechanism, reproducibility, or specificity, then we'll bump you up to a weak level of evidence. In order to get moderate, the studies we have to have some set of plausible mechanism, we have to have some amount of reproducibility, and some belief that the specificity is close enough to justify drawing conclusions from. Strong evidence only occurs when all of the evidence, or the vast bulk of the evidence, all points in the same direction, and there's not a whole bunch of disagreement. Okay, so that's the simple scoring system. So there's a couple of things to say about these things, right? In speculative evidence, right, these things are things that maybe make theoretical sense, but don't necessarily have a lot of evidence to support their assertion. And we see this a lot in spaceflight, right? People are like, well, maybe this is it, maybe this, right? Um, this is something that we created specifically to have a starting place, right? Where people can speculate about what may be contributing to risk or whether or not a countermeasure may work to reduce risk, right? But doesn't necessarily have enough evidence to really justify anything beyond saying this is a speculation on our part. When we think about weak evidence, right, these are not necessarily well understood, either mechanistically or epidemiologically, but you've got something that's moving it into a domain where we're going to take it more seriously, but not enough to say that, yeah, we would really hang our hat on this, right? A lot of times this is mechanism, right? We'll see mechanism a lot of times used as a plausible entry pathway for saying we should look at something more, that we can see a pathway by which this could really be working. But it could be, hey, we're seeing something happening over and over again, and we don't really know how it's happening. That's the reproducibility aspect. And so when we see a weak LOE score, that indicates that we've got a possible cause and effect between, the exposure and spaceflight and the outcome on humans that could lead to something that's clinically and operationally meaningful. And so for the risk board, it was sort of this is starting to rear its head up. We're not really sure yet, but you really should start paying attention here. Okay. Moderate has to have all of those things. A plausible mechanism. We've got a few examples of this thing that are reproducible. And it's close enough that we've really, believe that it's occurring in spaceflight. A lot of times what happens is we'll get epidemiologic evidence and then the mechanism is not fully understood. And that is not surprising, right? Biology is very complicated. You've all heard of this twins study where they went and looked at all of the omics, the transcriptomics, the genomics, the transcriptomics, the proteomics, the metabolomics, right? Finding, mechanism in that mass of information can be very challenging, but you've got a lot of stuff going on and there are plausible mechanisms, right? Note that we say something specific about animal and cellular evidence, right? They have to, in order to even be considered to meet something like the specificity guideline, they have to have jumped through all the hoops for rigor, right? And even then, we still have ongoing questions about whether or not we really could do that or not. And so we say it's a likely cause and effect between the spaceflight environment hazard or exposure and this effect on humans. And so when we get enough evidence that we have something at the moderate level, we may create a new risk. We may change design requirements. We may make recommendations for specific risk mitigation efforts like countermeasures, right? This is the level of evidence that really drives decision making. And that's what's important, right? To realize is that the moving from weak to moderate evidence is where you start to move from, hey, this is kind of theoretical to, hey, this is something we really might need to do something about, right? And then strong evidence, and it's hard to get to strong evidence, right? This is a broad level of consensus among subject matter experts. A lot of epidemiological evidence, pretty well understood mechanisms, right? It is agreement between laboratory and human subject results, animal and human subject results in that case. Animal studies by themselves can't get to coherence. But if animal studies and human subject results agree, it is something that very strongly can support a level of evidence of coherence. So in general, the things that are contributing to this have to have strong quality of evidence. So if you're kind of basing this on crappy quality of evidence studies, it probably doesn't really work, right? It indicates a deep understanding of our relationship between cause and effect. So this applies, and I'm going to show you how it applies both in general risk management and then also for directed acyclic graphs, right? Nodes on a graph. And so let's talk about some of those things. So one of the things that we see a lot of is analog studies, right? How do we weigh the level of evidence? NASA itself uses Hera and Chapia, right? Animals are a type of analog, right? We're using an animal and its physiology as an analog for human physiology. Some of the occupational cohorts that we use submarine workers and radiation workers and things like that, pilots, as analogs for astronauts, because some of the exposures match with the exposures that we would expect our astronauts to have, right? And you can keep going down farther into the weeds and biomarkers and organ on a chip type things and cellular stuff, right? Those are all analogs for a very human process that we are trying to look at in some way. And those analogs, every single analog makes a substitution in one or more of these four things: the organism, the setting, right? What's the context, the larger surrounding context, and a very specific exposure and outcome, right? If you use a mouse model to look at immune function in spaceflight, right? There's the exposure is the different things in spaceflight, and there may be several of them, right? It might be radiation, it might be microgravity or other things like that. And there's an outcome that you're looking at specifically in your experiment, right? T cell population or something like that. And so those four things are things that I want you to start getting used to thinking about when you're thinking about most of the research that's done, because a lot of it comes out as analog research. What is the organism, setting, exposure, and outcome? And I'm going to circle back to that later when I show you some of the applied uses of this, okay? So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through some of these examples. So applications for levels of evidence, right? This is how well do we think we know something? And it applies to overall risk posture, and then it applies to specific claims. So in the overall risk posture domain, right, we're asking ourselves two questions, right? So let me reframe us a little bit. Overall risk posture is, think of those 30 risks that the Human System Risk Board is thinking about, right? You've got the medical risk and the behavioral health risk and the immune risk and the dust risk, all those things we talked about. And we're trying to figure out, should that be a red, yellow, or green risk? And how well do we believe that we know that? So these are the questions you're asking yourself, right? What is the level of evidence of the body of applicable evidence that helps us understand the chances that there will be a consequential problem, right? Is this a problem? Does the evidence suggest that there is going to be a consequential problem? That is the English version of that, right? And if the answer to that is yes, then you need to ask the second question. Does the evidence suggest that we can effectively mitigate that problem, right? If the evidence is suggesting there's a consequential problem, then our risk is living in the red or yellow domain until we can mitigate it, right? Can we effectively mitigate it means, can we bring it down from red or yellow into green? So how do we show those things? This is the way that the HSRB did it. We would put for in-mission operations and long-term health, we'd have these two kind of boxes here, and we'd be looking at a very specific design reference mission category, short and long. And what you'd see here is, what is the L by C and the risk disposition? You see 1 by 2, and it's green, and it's accepted. There's some discussion about what drives the likelihood and the consequence, and there's some rationale and a level of evidence. In this case, it's strong, right? What we're showing here, and this is looks like this one is from the electrical shock one, is that phenomena is well understood, the requirements are well documented and adhered to by the program, and so we think the likelihood for plasma shock hazard on the ISS is very low, and we think we know that well. That's level of evidence. It's saying, hey, we're confident. Confidence is high, right? But there's not just that, right? What do you do with that then? If you have that confidence is high domain where it's strong, then you really can justify things like hey, we could close this risk and not call it a risk anymore. We could write standards based on this. We could write requirements based on this, flight rules. We could write countermeasures development, right? We probably really cannot justify doing more characterization research on this, which some scientists will inevitably always ask for, right? That's a strong level of evidence. What if we're speculative, right? What does that justify? It really justifies that characterization research, how we should be funding things that help us understand this better so that we can raise the level of evidence, right? One of the things that you'll see here is I put risk acceptance, and I meant to put it in all four of these. Risk acceptance can occur at any level of evidence, in part because, the mission is going to go potentially without us. And what we can say is, here's our best level of understanding. Here's all the uncertainty around it. If you guys are going to go, then you have to accept the risk that this might happen. Okay. We don't have to wait for a strong level of evidence to do risk acceptance. That's actually an agency decision that is about evidence communication, not justification. But when we're speculative, when we're low level of evidence, we really can't justify writing standards based on it. We really can't justify closing a risk or writing requirements. And it's probably not justified to do countermeasures development until we're really understanding whether it's needed, right? And so these in-between places are places where we work on countermeasures development, risk prioritization, in some cases standards as we get to moderate, right? Part of setting a level of evidence for the risk level is about saying, what should we be doing with this information? And there are some things that are justified and some things that are absolutely not justified, right? Now, if we go away from the overall risk level and we look at a specific claim, right? This is where we start using directed acyclic graphs, and we'll get into these more in the next lecture. But the specific claim is, hey, going from A to B, how well do we understand this part of the larger problem, right? And oftentimes this is about countermeasures, right? What should we include? What's going to have the biggest bang for the buck? And how well do we really understand that, right? So we apply levels of evidence in these cases as a visual difference between the connections between each of these nodes in a graph. So you can see some of these are strong, moderate, weak, speculative, and the way that we label these can just give us a quick visual insight into where do we have gaps in our knowledge, right? So when we do these for directed acyclic graphs and the graph stuff that's coming up, you'll see that, you'll see some of these things that are going to be based on this sort of legend, all right? And here's one of those graphs. This one is about sleep. And what I'm going to highlight here, now we kind of went through some of these before, but here's that individual readiness node, right? The black nodes over here are the outcomes we care about. What is affecting our individual readiness, right? There's a lot of different things: sleep inertia, fatigue, all sorts of different stuff, behavioral risk. Back here, I'm going to highlight the environmental conditions, right? How hot is it? And what's your atmospheric oxygen content? And how much noise is there, right? Those are all things that are rolled up underneath this node. And they are directly affecting how much in terms of sleep deficiencies you expect to see and whether your circadian misalignment is realigning or not, right? So I'm highlighting this for a second because I'm going to explode this out. But what I want you to take away from this before we go is that you see how these are thick black lines? We have strong levels of evidence that these things are affected by the environmental conditions. You can see in some places that we really don't have very strong evidence, right? Is schedule shifting really affecting stress? We kind of assume it is, but documented evidence, not so much. Our sleep deficiencies really feeding insomnia. Do we have good preventive countermeasures that are counteracting that, right? Circadian misalignment leading to some of these other things. It's not saying that it's not occurring. It's saying how strongly our evidence base is documented to support that. These are weak. Okay. So this is how we're using level of evidence to highlight where do we not know things as well as we think we should. And if we explode this environmental conditions one, right, that becomes all of these different nodes. And all of them going to these two nodes over here, circadian misalignment, sleep deficiencies. You can see that For several different things, we have some very strong evidence, like lighting affects that. And some of them, we have some weak evidence, right? The volume that you have available. How much does that contribute to sleep deficiencies? The temperature, very strong on sleep deficiencies, a moderate level of evidence for circadian misalignment. And this is taken from the corpus of knowledge that we have about the sleep environment. Okay. And it's documented here as well as other places, but we assign these levels of evidence and you can start to just immediately see some things are strong, some things are weak. So it gives you a graphic way to think about where might we need more understanding. Okay. So let's talk about some of the use examples for levels of evidence. One is when you're looking at technology readiness level, for example, or countermeasures readiness levels. NASA uses a TRL system that goes from 1 up to 9. In the area where we look at human spaceflight analogs, I've kind of highlighted level TRL, level 5 and 6, but all of these are appropriate to think about in the context of climbing the evidence ladder to get to something that is well proven and understood and a high level of evidence, right? These, in a sense, can be, in some ways, climbing the specificity ladder, right? What gets us out of a laboratory or basic principle to something that really works in a spaceflight environment. And so when you think about these colors, right, keep that in mind when we look at how are we applying these. Temporality and analogy. Mechanism is the building and testing phase. Specificity is within the demonstration domain, and reproducibility and coherence are up at TRL 9 and validation, right? So your level of evidence is climbing as you climb the TRL. TRL really is a reflection of how well do we think we understand that something works and is going to help us in spaceflight, all right? And this is the mapping of those different levels of evidence and the causal understanding that we've got as we go through it. So that's one way that this sort of maps into some of the things that we do for human spaceflight. Another one is looking at analog evidentiary utility, right? So when we talk about fidelity in analogs, remember that I mentioned early on that an analog is going to be a lot of different things that we draw information from. And those 4 things, organism, setting, exposure, and outcome. You really have a sense of a way to start figuring out, okay, how much faith should we be putting into this by starting to differentiate between when these things are real, like the actual human in the actual setting of spaceflight, with the actual radiation exposure, with the actual outcome, which is how much cancer did they get, right? This is the actual environment. And specificity for us is challenged by changing any of these things. But that's what an analog is. It changes some of those things, right? So how much does specificity get challenged? Okay. We have human research and we have non-human. So non-human may be primate. It may be animal. It may be organism in a petri dish, right? Like organoids. That's what I'm looking for. Cellular data, right? So remember in the beginning when they said cellular, molecular, animal, and they just said flight, not flight, right? This is a more detailed breakout of that. So human and not human definitely affecting your specificity, okay? And potentially your mechanism as well. And as you start to change one of these things, what we're doing is we're taking an example called Hamming distance. How many modifications from the original are you going to make, and how far away from the original does that take you? So if you actually have a human who's in space and they're exposed to microgravity and you're looking at, their SANS data, like did their eyeball change, right? That's a real setup. And if you change it to something like, yeah, it's a human, but now they're in a laboratory setting and we had to simulate it by head down, bed rest, tilt. And even though we were still looking at the actual back of the eyeball, right? You're looking at a lot of things changing, and these are these changes now potentially introduce confounding factors that we may not be tracking. So what we're looking at is this function of Hamming distance potentially becoming a limiting factor for a level of evidence that you can get from analogs, right? Can you really get to coherence or even a moderate level of evidence on some of these things when you have this much substitution in there? We're still struggling to figure this out, but this is part of the way that we're heading, right? So level of evidence is a function of how close you're getting to the real thing when it comes to analogs. All right. So let me bring you back to that very first paper that we talked about. And I told you that at the very first paper, right, they basically said, oh my God, this is going to be one of the worst things that we're going to face in a Mars mission. It's going to be, everybody's going to get brain damage, right? So where did the media folks get that headline? They got it from this quote, and it's from a thing called number needed to harm, which we use clinically in research. And they said, hey, our number needed to harm that we calculated, get rid of that. Our number needed to harm that we calculated from our research data was 3.5 to 5. What that means is that in a crew of 5 astronauts traveling to Mars, we would expect at least one member to display severe deficits in each of those cognitive functions by the time they return to Earth. Okay, so that's the claim in the paper that led to this headline. And now let's talk about whether we think that that's justified, right? So what if I told you that they did that experiment with rats at the NSRL, okay? And not only did they do the rats at the NSRL, but the beam was limited in terms of what it could provide. So it didn't really replicate the type of radiation that the humans would have in space. And then the way that they figured out that they were brain damaged is they did behavioral assessments of the rats. Okay. So what you're seeing here is that the setting was a substitute in NSRL. The organism was a surrogate, and it was rats. The exposure was simulated. It was not the actual radiation they were going to see. And the outcome was a proxy. It was a proxy for human stuff. It was the rodent behavioral stuff. So when I look back at this, we have a surrogate with a substitute setting with a simulated exposure with a proxy outcome. So is it possible to get to a high level of evidence on this? This is the absolute worst case in terms of analog translation or generalization to human outcomes. It's not saying they couldn't do better. They could, but this is what they did, right? So they're in the farthest Hamming distance away from reality, or away from what we expect to actually be the case. In which case, we would only label this particular study as speculative in the very best case scenario, right? We can't really get mechanism. We can't get specificity. There was no reproducibility on it. It doesn't approach coherence. So they've got temporality and analogy, all right? So it fails also to articulate many of the quality of evidence stuff for any of the animal studies requirements, right? Did they meet all those things in that table that we showed? So, we can't actually get any higher than this, probably, for this. And honestly, we're really down at about here. All right. So why isn't it specificity, right? Well, it's rats. It was neutron radiation, right? And then the translational challenges that were occurring between a rat behavior and saying that humans are going to have brain damage, right? Cognitive function, it's really hard to say that you can really hang your hat on this when that is what was done that was in that study. So I highlight this not to beat on that study, right? It's a good piece of research in a sense. They did the best they can with the resources that they had available. They contributed to a growing body of research, right? The one thing that happened that caught the media's attention was oh man, they said that they're really going to hurt astronauts based on this one piece of research with these rats in the simulated radiation, not in space, right? But you didn't get any of that sense from the beginning when I showed you the story, because none of that sense was really given in the media article, that you really can't make a like-to-like comparison. And you really can't use a term like number needed to harm to translate into a generalizable conclusion about humans. And this is the reason why we had to create a new level of evidence approach in scoring, so we could actually provide justification for saying, you know what, you can say all the things you want in your paper, but we're not going to accept this as a strong level of evidence based on these things, which we require to demonstrate both the rigor, quality of evidence, and the overall assessment of the full body of literature. Because when you look out beyond that paper, you don't have a whole bunch of things saying that astronauts are going to go get brain damage on a mission to Mars, at least not at that level, right? So reviewing these things, it's not meant to be exhaustive. It's designed to give us a way to start systematically differentiating between what should we hang our hat on and what shouldn't we, and to make it public facing so people understand by what criteria we're actually evaluating them. Okay. These things, quality of evidence and level of evidence, are most useful in providing non-experts a way to question expert interpretations, right? So what often happened at the risk board was you'd have scientists come in and make these assertions, and most of the time people would sit there looking at it and they wouldn't know what to ask. They wouldn't know how to challenge it because it wasn't their area of expertise. But it's very easy to say, can you talk a little bit more about why you would justify a level of evidence of moderate in this case? It gives people a way to start having the conversation in a domain they might not be completely familiar with. And so this is a big reason why quality of evidence and level of evidence are so important. Because in an area where we don't have lots and lots of data from people in space, we still need to make decisions. And we also still need to communicate with people how well we think we know what we're talking about. All right. So that's the end of this lecture on levels of evidence. The next one is really going to be digging into causal diagramming for risk communication. And if you've been following along, the first one that we did was really on overall risk. The second one was on risk management processes that were used at NASA. The third one was on how do we quantify that risk, PRA analyses and other. And this one was really about the levels of evidence, talking through some of these challenges, because this is, I think, one of the hardest ways to struggle through what should you say in a conversation about these things. So moving from that associative epidemiologic framework for evidence into a causal framework for evidence, which is what we did, is something that then created the basis for causal diagramming, directed acyclic graphs. We're going to talk more about what that is and how we do it, not just about how we apply it in the next lecture. So let me stop there and ask what questions we've got. Maybe I should ask, Brian, are you still out there?
I'm right here.
All right. Fantastic. Now, this is a challenging one, so it might be a little while before you think of questions, but as we go through some of the things we go through in the next year or so, you'll see this starting to come up again and again.
Yeah, I'm most interested in how, it with some of my experience so far, it just seems like there's quite a bit of extrapolation of very small data sets to really figure out what's relevant. So this all makes sense, and I am beginning to see that this really is an important concept to grasp. But I think, is cool that as we get more information, we'll have to extrapolate less and less and be able to actually figure out what's really going on with like kind of first order studies. So
in a sense, this is going to be second nature for you, because in your training and residency, other things like that, right, going through journal clubs, really you're always asking that question of, should this study change my practice, right? in clinical medicine. And we're not always asking that exact question in space medicine, especially on the research side, especially on the overall understanding side, on the design and the requirements side. But you can kind of modify that question every time. Should this evidence justify a change in requirements, for example? Should this evidence that I've got here in front of me justify a new standard? And, there's a modification of that question that you're very used to. But there's also in this sort of, Rob and I have spent a lot of time trying to work on making sure that we are providing a foundation that is public facing that people can point at for that.
Martina has a question that's in the chat.
I see a question. Yeah, Gabriel.
Hi there. Great lecture, by the way. I'm curious, has there ever been a intubation in space of an astronaut for a life-saving scenario?
Nope. No, there has never been anything that approaches critical care in space at this point. Now, Dave Williams, who was a Canadian astronaut, did do some animal surgery in space. And I think I don't think they intubated because it was actually just rats. But they did anesthetize the rats, and they did go through surgical process and stuff like that. And that's probably the most complex stuff that's been done, and it was done in the research capacity, right? There have been lots of medical things that have happened in space, but nothing that has ever required an intubation. There was one astronaut who was on record thinking about intubating both himself and his colleagues, and that was Jerry, what's his name? Lindenberg, on the Mir space station when you had the SFOG fire, because there was so much smoke in the atmosphere. He was very concerned about the atmosphere and the smoke in the atmosphere that he actually thought about intubating himself and his colleagues for protection. And you can find that right up in the public in a book called Dragonfly by Brian Burroughs, who interviewed lots of people about not just that event, but the whole Shuttle Mir program. Yeah, there's not been any need for any kind of critical care level care to this point. It's probably going to be needed when we start spending long time on the moon or, long times on Mars. But probably not before then is my guess. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. I was curious. Thank you.
It'd be very interesting to study the potential mechanics of how to intubate somebody in microgravity or within gravity.
I mean, it's hard enough doing it on Earth, now floating around and doing it.
Yeah, and that's part of the challenge. I mean, astronauts have actually tried to play with positioning and things like that. And Dave Williams, we'll see if we can get him here for like a career talk or something like that. They do have pictures of them playing with the laryngoscope, both on Skylab as well as some of the shuttles things. But think about using your arm for leverage when you're not stuck to anything. And you're really just moving yourself rather than opening up the airway, for example. So the mechanics of it are not, I think, very well understood. There have been a few ways that people have thought about doing it, but nothing that anybody's ever really tried to do well.
And considering the impact on how critical it is in minutes, in the case you have to do an intubation, figuring out how you would do it beforehand would be probably very prudent.
I think they do have procedures that are, in theory, what they would do. But the big challenge really has been, and this is something that we as a medical community often kind of do, right? We play the what if game. Well, what if this happens, right? Well, there's the second question to the what if game, which is how likely is it to happen? And from the earlier talks on PRA analysis, you can actually stratify likelihood, right? Probability of occurrence. And we do that in a lot of ways. And so when you start to get down to a really low probability of occurrence for needing a secured airway for some reason, then it's like, how much effort are you going to put into sussing that out on the agency side? It's a great research project for people outside the agency. It's not really a great use of time for people inside the agency to kind of go beyond a certain point, right? And so there are not a ton of those probability of occurrence numbers that are publicly out there, but there are a few of them. One of them is on the paper that we put out in 2019 and was republished in 2022 on accepted medical conditions lists for human spaceflight that shows you how we do that assessment. And another one that I did in 2018 or 2019, which was a comparison of two different types of Mars missions, where in the appendix I put in what were the medical conditions that kind of rose to the top in terms of likelihood of occurrence. So you got to keep that in the back of your mind, right? With so few people in space and so few missions, critical care stuff has not floated up to the top yet. And as the number of people in space increase and the number of missions increase, then you'll start to see that likelihood change.
Perfect. Perfectly explained. Thank you.
And Erik, just want to make sure you see Martina's message or question in the chat. She's not able to unmute.
Oh. Martina, okay. Into which extent does quality of a peer-reviewed journal or number of citations reflect quality of a paper? Oh, that's an interesting one, right? Just because it's in a major journal, does that mean we should take it seriously? It's a good question. I mean, there's peer review has a lot of challenges these days, and I think a lot of people are pointing them out. And yet, it is undeniable that some peer review is better than none, right? Having people check our work is a critical part of science. And so what I think is really important to kind of keep in mind is I don't know that I would say that citations or H-index necessarily are a reflection of quality of evidence. I think it might be. It's certainly going to be a reflection of how many people have looked at this thing. But to get to quality of evidence, you really need subject matter experts within that domain kind of assessing and referencing that. And the challenge I think that we have is that when we think about quality of evidence in the context of applicability to space flight, right? That's a different thing than necessarily quality of evidence in terrestrial medicine, because you may have an applicability challenge, right? And that's where we use the sort of level of evidence thing, right? Do we really have a mechanism? Is it reproducible? And the specificity question is the big one. And peer reviewers for terrestrial medicine are oftentimes not explicitly asking about specificity. They might be implicitly asking about it, but not explicitly. And so I don't necessarily think that there's certainly a floor on peer review, right? Predatory journals and things like that, they're not going to be, I wouldn't consider them good references. But you have to have the ability to critically evaluate the literature yourself and to be able to articulate, hey, if I'm going to hold up this study as evidence of a reason to do something, why I think it's good enough to do that. And that's not something you're going to get from peer reviewers implicitly, right? Because you're always asking, does this apply to my problem? Not necessarily, is this paper in general rigorously done? So that nuance is important to keep in mind. Does that help, Martina? We shall see. Okay. Well, I think that if there's no other questions, then we're probably done for today. The last lecture in this series is going to be on Friday, I think. Is that right, Brian?
That's correct. Same time on Friday. We will. I've sent out an email to kind of a bunch of folks. I'll draw my email here in the chat if you'd like to be added specifically to the list about these lectures. But Michael's also sending them out, I think, as a lot of you found your way here. So yeah, my email's there. Please shoot me an email if you'd like to be added to the specific email threads about this. But thanks so much, Erik. This is great.
All right. Thanks, everybody.